I'm J.G. Michael, and this is Parallax Views. This edition of Parallax Views is brought to you by the $10 and above tier supporters of Parallax Views on Patreon. So, with that in mind, producers credit shoutouts to Gunnar, Mark, Simon, Alexander, Catherine, Tilo, Emilia, Jeff, John, Bert, Brian, Elliot, Michael, Brace, James, Nick, Mersham, Galen, Arlen, Bo, Christopher, Michael, Gigadelic Media, Chance, Chase, Dan, Big Bob, David H., Y. Kellerman, Saaded 13, Kathleen, David, Ava, Bob, The West Bank Robbery Podcast, Jamie, Enoch, Gary, Max, Ishtofer, James, Martin, Matthew Ho, Brian, Nobody, Thomas, and Dano. And now on to the show. Hey there, Parallax Views listeners. Before we get started, a reminder that if you appreciate the work here I do, I could really use your support on Patreon at patreon.com/parallaxviews. I am without an advertiser at this moment, so your support is needed now, more than ever, to keep this show going. So if you can, please donate at patreon.com/parallaxviews. Even the smallest donation will help. I should note that I'm a little bit behind on getting out the Parallax Vlog bonus episode. Usually we only do about one a month, but I did two this month, and it's taking me a little bit more time to get it out there because I've been so busy with a number of other interviews. The news is moving so fast, and I'm just trying to keep up. I'm trying to keep my head above water because the news is coming in like a flood. So, on this edition of the show, we're going to be hearing from two different guests. Later on, we'll be hearing from former advisor to the State Department and a regular contributor at the American Conservative, James W. Carden, about the curious movement known as national conservatism, which has some big backers out there like Peter Thiel and I believe even J.D. Vance. It paints itself as very much in the mold of America First, but it has, shall we say, some really interesting foreign policy views that are quite hawkish, despite NatCons painting themselves as realists. They're especially hawkish on Iran and China. Also, they seem to be pushing a rather theocratic agenda. Now, James, as you can guess from him being a writer at the American Conservative, is a conservative-minded fellow, but he's very critical of both the theocratic tendencies of national conservatism and the NatCon's foreign policy views. So we'll be talking about that in the second segment. But first, Eli Clifton of the Quincy Institute joins us to discuss his article for The Guardian. Netanyahu is presiding over a sharp decline in the U.S.'s pro-Israel consensus. This article, of course, came on the heels of about half of Democrats in Congress boycotting Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's speech to Congress, which was protested by thousands outside the Capitol. We'll be talking about where the U.S. Israel relationship may be headed and how it could be changing at some point in the future. The consensus on that relationship may be changing. All that and much more in the conversation with Eli Clifton. Let's get right to it. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that we have on quite frequently at this point. Eli Clifton is a senior advisor at the Quincy Institute and investigator at large for the Quincy Institute's web magazine, Responsible Statecraft. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing good. I mean, times are kind of dark, especially after having to see that Netanyahu speech. I think you'll offer a little bit of a different take on it. I think a lot of people are focusing on the 58 standing ovations that he got,
Wow, is that
that
the
Bibi
count?
got, but I think you have you want to look beyond that in a lot of ways. So let's talk about your initial reaction to it.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the standing ovations, if it was 58, wow, or whatever it was, one can't take away from that, right? Is that, there were still the optics of, Benjamin Netanyahu speaking for the fourth time before Congress, which is unbelievable, receiving these standing ovations in the middle of, a highly controversial war he's undertaken in Gaza. And the gist of what I wrote for The Guardian is that you gotta look beyond this because the optics alone, tell well the story, we're discussing right now. What was going on though behind the scenes was very different than what we saw. The truth is that support for Israel in this war has been going down. And that Netanyahu's political future in Israel is on the rocks in ways that it hasn't been before. And perhaps more importantly, because, hey, you know what? Netanyahu has an unbelievable number of more lives than a cat when it comes to his political life in Israel. We shouldn't get ahead of ourselves talking about his political demise. What does seem to be irreversible is the downward decline in American support for Israel's actions. And, I mean, and I think that's pretty evident in the declining support that Joe Biden got for his support for Israel's war, for his bear hug strategy of Netanyahu, and by all accounts, that quickly led to backlash within the Democratic base. Biden dropped out of the presidential race with 38% of voters saying they were less likely to vote for him due to his handling of the war in Gaza. The Century Foundation, I recommend everybody look at this poll. It was really interesting that found, quote, many core constituencies, including independents, swing state likely voters, and Democratic Party activists are angry at Biden's unqualified support for Israel's assault on Gaza, end quote. So in that context, what we were seeing was, listen, look who was in attendance at the speech, largely Republicans. Around 100 Democratic members of Congress boycotted the speech. So what we're seeing is this supposed, no daylight between the U.S. and Israel really turning into what could only be described as partisan. And that is a huge breaking point in the pro-Israel consensus that Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders have enjoyed. And I think that was what was most evident during the speech and before and after, was that Democrats stayed away from it. Democrats saw it as a political liability, and Democrats saw it as potential political upside for them to distance themselves, not just from Benjamin Netanyahu, who's deeply unpopular for a host of reasons, but from the policies that he has implemented and the political hold that he's held over U.S. policy.
And I should have mentioned at the top of this, the Guardian article you wrote was entitled "Netanyahu is presiding over a sharp decline in the U.S.'s pro-Israel consensus." People can check that out. It was published on July 25th. Uh, so with regards to I think it was about half of Democrats in Congress boycotted this speech. Now, I know a lot of Palestinian activists that I've spoken to weren't necessarily, that hyped about that. They would say to me, well, Nancy Pelosi's comments didn't mention Palestinians, but I still think it's significant that Pelosi called it, I think she called it the worst speech by a foreign minister given to Congress. And she may have not mentioned Palestinians. She did mention the hostages' families a bit in that tweet. But, I still think that's significant, even if she wasn't talking enough about the Palestinian people and their concerns.
Look, I mean, I totally understand, and it's legitimate frustration that Palestinian activists, as well as any critics of Israel and of the U.S.-Israel relationship, must have, which is that we are talking about, small incremental cracks and maybe steps towards a more balanced relationship between the United States and Israel that's a little more normalized, and one where we can talk about, hey, what do U.S. interests happen to be? We're not just here to serve the interests of a foreign country for the sake of doing so. But I think that, yeah, Pelosi's statement, I think that congressional Democrats, a significant number of them deciding that they weren't going to attend, and again, I think we should contextualize this in the political moment that it occurred. which is also that Joe Biden just dropped out of the race. And Kamala Harris, you know, obviously very pro-Israel in many respects, but already in the remarks that she gave after her meeting with Netanyahu, first the body language before the meeting was decidedly colder than that which Joe Biden had exhibited toward Netanyahu, and her language afterwards, which was really sort of placing the onus on Netanyahu and on the Israelis to agree to a hostage deal, and saying that they are going to need to conduct a full withdrawal from population centers in Gaza, which would seem to directly refute or at least be in contradiction with some of the statements made by Netanyahu in the speech, which was essentially saying that they were going to maintain, dominant security position within Gaza in perpetuity. Kamala Harris basically said that that's just not going to be the case, or not. That's certainly not something she is in support of. Again, I understand these are small steps here. We're still a long ways from the United States using the leverage that it has to shape Israeli policy, namely by actually enforcing some of the so-called red lines. For instance, suspending weapons transfers to Israel. Those are all measures that would be a furtherance of these ideas and trying to actually get U.S. policy implemented. But we're still in the early days of Kamala Harris's candidacy. The political ground, certainly within the Democratic Party, just shifted. The political conversation in the country just shifted. And it seems as if right now there is an opportunity for congressional Democrats as well as for Kamala Harris to create some daylight, not just between them and Netanyahu, but between them and the policies that the Biden administration, or really Joe Biden, has been a part of.
How long do you think this shift has been? I guess the word would be in the making, because I do think over the years we've seen AIPAC become much closer to the Republican Party, so much so that there was even that whole thing 10 years back where J Street started rising up as like the alternative for Democrats, the
Right.
other Israel lobby. And I do think things are changing. You have people like Miriam Adelson and her late husband, Sheldon Adelson, becoming so close to the Republican Party. And I do think that's created an issue in the Democratic Party where they're maybe getting farther away, not necessarily even from Israel, but at least the sort of Likud and Netanyahu-led Israel.
Yeah, I think that and I discussed some of this in the column I wrote, which is that appearances can be deceiving, and one would, for instance, assume based off of just optics of what we've seen over the past couple of weeks at the RNC and at the Netanyahu speech before Congress, that there is lockstep Republican support for Israel. And of Netanyahu, and that there is no room for criticism of Israeli policies, or suggesting that U.S. and Israeli policy and interests may diverge at any given point. There were Israeli flags on the floor of the Republican National Convention. Now, that, as you just described, that closeness between the Republican Party and Israel, that's been in the making for a very long time. That was something that Jerry Falwell helped put in place with connecting Christian evangelicals and Christian Zionists with neoconservatives and the pro-Israel components of Washington. But that increasing partisanship of it, I think, does track with the Adelsons rising as political donors since the early mid-aughts, when they really stepped up. They've now given since the late early 2000s, they've been the biggest political donors in every single cycle, certainly to Republicans. And it's not just to Republican presidential candidates, it's to members of Congress as well. So in that context, they create an incentive for Republicans to toe this line that they have clearly doing with those multiple standing ovations you described. When your biggest funder is requesting this, it becomes transactional, for lack of a better term, right? You need those campaign funds, so you're gonna do these things. But there are, even on the Republican side, you're starting to see some cracks in it where
Rand Paul and Thomas Massie. Yeah,
exactly. Paul and Massie both show that you can criticize the so-called Israel lobby. You can split with the Republican Party on this. And listen, I'm sure that Massie and Paul do not get any campaign support from the Adelsons. So that's the trade-off that they had to choose to do. But for their base. And in both cases, I think both Massie and Paul have plenty of evangelicals as their constituents, have plenty of probably Christian Zionists as their constituents. It doesn't seem like it is an issue that is really putting their seats into jeopardy. So while it may jeopardize their campaign contributions from the party's biggest donor, it doesn't seem to jeopardize their electability. And I think that's something that doesn't get discussed and probably should be reflected on just a little bit more.
Yeah, I wanted to delve into that just briefly a little bit more. I've had guests on that have said, there may be changes even in the Republican base when it comes to Israel because, you know, the sort of America First crowd uh, is kind of, why should we be giving all this money to Ukraine? Regardless of what one thinks of the Russo-Ukrainian war, there is that sentiment amongst Republicans. And I do think there's some of that sentiment you see amongst the America First sort of Republicans saying, well, why do we have to be giving all this money to Israel? And I do think that uh, will lead to some type of shift potentially going forward.
Yeah, I mean, listen, the seeds are obviously planted for it. The only area in which I might just quibble or maybe actually want to add on to what you just said is that I mean, I'm not sure who we describe as sort of leading the so-called America First movement, but what I can say is, is obviously sort of the shining star of it, or the person that's seen as sort of the the figurehead is Trump. And Trump actually has expressed more nuanced views toward the U.S. Israel relationship. And he did so when he was first running for president in 2015, 2016, and in the Republican primary debates. He was the only person on the stage who was willing to, who said that actually he thought the U.S. Should play more of an even-handed role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He also said about the Iran nuclear deal that his main beef with it was that Iran was buying too many Airbus planes and wasn't ordering enough Boeing planes. And he never changed from those views and statements until the moment that he had clinched the nomination and needed to raise something like $1 billion to run a general election campaign, and he needed the Adelson's support. And at that moment, he flipped and he never went back. And I think people, want to then apply this notion of, well, look, he can be, kind of nuanced or at least questioning of the state of the so-called blob mentalities on something like Iran, or sorry, on something like Ukraine. But on Israel, he has never gone back to what he was before. That doesn't mean those weren't his true views, but it's pretty clear he engaged in something transactional at that point in time, given that he just changed on a dime on the Iran nuclear deal, on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He agreed to new commitments like moving the U.S. embassy to Jerusalem. And in doing so, I think he kind of showed to everyone the power and the necessity of the Adelson's campaign contributions. You need that money if you're going to run for president. You might not need it as a primary candidate, but you're sure going to need it when you need to run in all 50 states for election day.
I know that you don't cover this in the article, but I wanted to ask you about it. How much do you think the fallout from the JCPOA and it not getting renewed, and Republicans were very against it, and a lot of pro-Israel voices were very against the JCPOA. How much do you think that has led to strain on the relationship between Democrats and maybe really right-wing pro-Israel elements?
I don't know if it creates, well, I mean, it's right wing in Israel or right wing pro-Israel elements in the
In the U.S., I was going
Oh,
to say, yeah.
um, I had never thought of it that. What I would say is I think it certainly did create strain between the broader pro-Israel lobby as well as Israel itself and Democrats. When AIPAC until the JCPOA generally avoided having to publicly engage in campaigns. They certainly didn't engage in electoral campaigns, which they do now, and they certainly didn't engage in highly controversial, highly contested issue campaigns. And that all changed with their anti-JCPOA efforts. And I think that they, frankly, they went up against a Democratic president on his signature foreign policy initiative. And that's something that when you do that, it's hard to go back from that. It's hard not to see that you threw in with, there's a perception, real or false, that you've thrown in with partisan elements, that you've thrown in with anti-Obama elements, that you've thrown in with the Republican Party. And the truth is that that probably wasn't actually AIPAC's intent. It was that they did have their arms twisted, both by their donors as well as potentially by elements in Israel, to take on this campaign because Netanyahu had said that he was absolutely opposed to the JCPOA. And where could they find allies for it? Because the White House had gone to Democratic members of Congress and said this is your president's signature foreign policy initiative, and it shouldn't be that surprising that they chose the president over AIPAC at that point. I mean, while AIPAC can, certainly help steer some campaign funds, the president of the United States and the de facto head of the Democratic Party has a lot more capability to do so. So the raw politics of it were that, yeah, they were going to side with Obama on that. But I think that that AIPAC got involved in that fight, that they put themselves there or were forced into that situation. If we have to talk about a moment when maybe the pro-Israel consensus stopped being bipartisan, I think that was probably a pivotal period of time.
That was a much better way to put it than how I worded it. I think that was a point where things became less clear with regards to the bipartisanship. I also wanted to ask you about I know a lot of people have said that Kamala's speech about Gaza recently took on a very different tone in a lot of ways than Biden. And a lot of people have said that it was more empathetic towards the plight of Palestinians in Gaza. I know, again, I have a lot of Palestinian activists who will say, well, empathy is not enough at this point. We need actual policy. But I do think that night and day difference between Kamala Harris and Biden and how they've talked about this is significant. So can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, listen, they're not wrong, the activists you're speaking with, but American politics, policy changes slowly. Words and sentiments do matter. And I think that, given that, Kamala Harris is in a tricky spot, in that if she wants to differentiate herself from the Biden policies, she is still and has been a part of that administration. Now, by no means does the vice president get to drive or steer policy. It's entirely possible that they've been doing things that she doesn't entirely agree with. I think she has to be pretty careful in that, though. What I did see in her remarks was a shift in tone. She was acknowledging, that she was centering Palestinians' death and suffering. She was centering the responsibilities that Netanyahu and Israel have in making a ceasefire deal with a hostage release feasible. And that is something that does actually run counter to much of the talking points that have been coming out of the Biden administration, where they have continually said, even when it was demonstrably false, that the entire responsibility for making a hostage deal possible fell on Hamas. They have constantly said that that Hamas were somehow the impediment to making a ceasefire and a hostage release possible. That's not what Kamala Harris said. Now, she didn't outright blame Israel in an explicit way, but just looking at what she said and how she said it, she made it pretty clear that the focus was on Israel in making such a deal possible, and that the landscape of such a deal was not going to be, as we discussed earlier, Israeli security control in perpetuity over population centers in Gaza. She basically said that's not going to happen, and they need to do a deal now. And I do think that is meaningfully different. Again, I understand the frustration. I think a lot of us would like to see this administration do more to end this war and to use the leverage it has. And I think Kamala Harris, hopefully she talks about what she would do as president. Hopefully she lays out, a platform that explains, the ways in which she would use U.S. power, influence, and leverage to try to bring this conflict to an end. But in the meantime, again, speaking as the vice president, which she is, which has no official policymaking influence or power, I think it's certainly a breath of fresh air, frankly, coming out of this administration.
Before we close out, is there anything else that I didn't cover in this conversation that you think is worth saying right now about the U.S. Israel relationship?
I think I'd like to just start, end where we started, which is that maybe not for Republicans yet, but for Democrats, they are increasingly having to balance the benefits that are afforded to them by AIPAC and the political contributions that it can help steer, and affiliated and parallel groups like the Democratic Majority for Israel, against what may be the real political costs in an electoral sense of refusing to question where U.S. and Israeli interests diverge. And it is entirely possible that, the Israel that is, here now in 2024 has, decided that its interests are in, effectively engaging in a war of ethnic cleansing, of expanding its control over the West Bank, potentially entering into a conflict with Lebanon. And it's entirely possible that there's very little the United States can do to stop that. Which brings us to kind of an important moment where, policymakers as well as, elected officials have to start asking questions about how much of this do we want to be a part of? Is this smart as politicians who need to run for re-election? And is this smart, in the national interest of the United States? Is this in our interests to be a part of what could be, escalating into a pretty devastating regional war?
In that regard, how significant do you think the dissatisfaction of, I believe it's 100,000 Arab and Muslim voters in a swing state like Michigan? How significant do you think that has been? I'm of course referring to the uncommitted balance in the Democratic primary.
I mean, I think it's enormously impactful because it has been seen as only a political upside in the Democratic and Republican parties to be knee-jerk pro-Israel. And the uncommitted campaign in Michigan and those 100,000 uncommitted ballots sent a very clear message that this is no longer cost-free. This comes at, with real political costs in a swing state, and that politicians need to start listening to the other side as well.
I also wanted to ask, and I know this is speculative, but do you think, well, we can't read the minds of the Democratic Party, but I feel like right now, if they could find a way to get a ceasefire happening, that would probably be a big foreign policy win for Democrats going into this election. Do you think that's going to play a role in where Democrats are headed with this in the next few months?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely think that the Biden administration would love to get a ceasefire for a host of reasons, and that's not a small one. Is the that would play well in campaign season to show that they have a real foreign policy achievement under their belts. The cynical side of me though would say that Netanyahu probably knows that too, and he's pretty good at pushing things down the road that he doesn't want to do, and maybe he would actively try to avoid agreeing to such a deal, at least until after the election, for precisely those reasons, because it's very clear that Netanyahu and Likud would prefer a Trump presidency over a Harris presidency at this point in time.
Well, hey, Eli Clifton, I want to thank you again for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work? And what's your handle on X or Twitter or whatever it's being called these days?
My handle is Eli Clifton, and also you can read most of my stuff at responsiblestatecraft.org.
Next up, James W. Carden of the American Conservative joins us to discuss the curious movement known as national conservatism. Now, listen, James and I are from two very, very different ends of the political spectrum, and we don't agree on all the issues. He writes for the American Conservative. I tend to be associated with the left, progressive sometimes, although I like to say that I'm very independent-minded when it comes to politics. I do think we have a lot of differing views on a number of issues. However, this piece he wrote for the American Conservative, Neocons by Another Name, and he co-wrote this with Colonel Douglas McGregor. I found this to be a very striking piece because it gets into some of the issues that a conservative like Carden has with the national conservatism movement that has been backed by figures like Peter Thiel and J.D. Vance. And I think you'll find that the concerns James Carden raises are concerns that aren't limited to the right. I think a lot of folks on the left would share these concerns, maybe for different reasons, things like that. But just hear James out. He has a different view than a lot of my listeners, but I think there's a good bit to chew on here in this conversation. And, we talk about the sort of theocratic streak in national conservatism and the hawkishness of national conservatism when it comes to issues such as Iran. And so, with that being said, let's get right to it with James W. Carden. Welcome back to Parallax Views, a guest that I'm always happy to have on. James W. Carden is a columnist and former advisor to the U.S. Russia Bilateral Presidential Commission at the U.S. Department of State, and he's written for publications like The Nation, The American Conservative, Responsible Statecraft, The Spectator Unheard, and many others. How are you doing, James?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me back.
So I know Scott Horton already interviewed you about this. I just found that out today, but I wanted to talk to you about an article you wrote for The American Conservative entitled Neoconservatism by Another Name. And this has to do with a movement, I guess, calling itself national conservatism. For people that are unaware, what is this national conservatism movement?
It sprang up a number of years ago after the publication of a Israeli political philosopher, Hazony, and he's sort of like an Israeli version of Patrick Deneen, who published a kind of a similar book around that time. And Hazony's book is about nationalism. He went on to found something called the Edmund Burke Foundation, and that foundation went on to kind of start a series of, I guess you would call them conferences, conventions, about this thing called national conservatism. It sort of is a little like post-liberalism in that they aren't typical conservatives. They aren't like fusionists. And by that, I mean, they aren't like National Review conservatives where, it's like free market. They're not doctrinaire on the economy.
They're not part of necessarily what the American Conservative or people adjacent to that type of publication would call conservative Inc.
Yeah, that's okay. Right. Their foreign policy is, as I guess we'll get into, very mixed. So unlike Conservatism Inc., which very much includes places like National Review, the old Weekly Standard, and stuff like that, they are not totally into the idea that we should be fighting a new Cold War with Russia. They tend not to be supportive of the American NATO proxy war in Ukraine. Some of them have voiced a good deal of skepticism with regard to NATO expansion. On other areas of foreign policy, particularly in the Middle East and in Asia, their positions are pretty close, if not indistinguishable, to that of neoconservatism.
Yeah, let's delve into that more. Where would you say their policies are most akin to neoconservatives and things like the Project for a New American Century, the Wolfowitz Doctrine? I mean, I'm assuming it has to mainly do a lot with Israel.
That's what it seems like, yeah. So Hazony, as I mentioned, or maybe I didn't mention, is a Israeli. He raised his family in the occupied territories. He was a speechwriter for Bibi Netanyahu. So his whole career has been spent in the precincts of the Israeli far right. His book talks about how there's a biblical Old Testament mandate for the creation of nation states, which is a unique and pretty ahistorical understanding of when nation states came about. So they are very hardline, as hardline as any neoconservative is on Israel. And so if you have that sort of positioning, I don't see any point. And so basically, the problem with it is that under the kind of rubric of national conservatism, they're laundering neoconservative ideas under this new kind of banner.
Right, they're
Um,
claiming to be realists, but then laundering this sort of neoconservatism when it comes to Iran and China.
yeah, yeah, exactly right. And so they don't share, with the exception of European policy, they really don't adhere to or share in the American, realist tradition. And so it seems to me, and to libertarians like Scott Horton
Kelly
and
Vlahos is another one.
Kelly, and I've read some critical things about national conservatism and Hazony from the Cato Institute as well. They're really opposed to this rebranding of neoconservatism, and I think for very good reasons. I myself am not a libertarian, but I very much, and my politics are pretty much in the mold of like Pat Buchanan circa 1992. So I find this movement with all of its money and prestige and all of the names attached to it to be quite troubling. And there really haven't been that many people who have spoken out against it for that reason, because what they've been able to do is to co-opt a lot of the movement, even parts of what we were calling conservatism Inc. So at these conferences you see people like Rich Lowry show up, who's the longtime editor of National Review. So you see some of the figures from the mainstream conservative movement now being co-opted into this thing, which seems to me to be, given its Israeli roots, to be kind of a non-American, a kind of, as Doug McGregor and I, Doug co-wrote the article with me, it seems to be another foreign import in which to convince Americans that their safety lies in endless war. So that's a very dangerous thing. But fortunately, now you're starting to see some people come out of the woodwork. And I thought Kelly Lahos's article in Responsible Statecraft, which appeared before my article, was an excellent report. She did something that I didn't want to do, which was actually sit through that stuff and actually listen to it. I didn't go, but she's been to a bunch of these, and she understands very well what they're about.
They've got a lot of big name backers. I don't know if he's still involved with them, but I believe Peter Thiel, the Silicon Valley billionaire, was very involved with national conservatism and sort of I think he even spoke at one of their conferences.
Yeah, that's my understanding as well. And of course, his political protege, J.D. Vance, has also spoken at the National Conservative conferences, as has, I believe, another one of his high profile proteges, Blake Masters, out in Arizona. Masters ran for the Senate in Arizona a couple of years ago and failed. And now he's currently running for the House out there. So
I'm not mentioning it to say that Till is the only one like that, but it seems like
sure.
I'm mentioning it because this does have backing from influential people. And I think folks that don't follow the National Conservatives need to understand, like, they do have influencers backing them, and that's going to, I think, snowball and get them places.
Well, I think that's already happening. Yeah, it's almost certainly. You see so much crossover, not only with the mainstream conservative movement, but also with a lot of these sort of conservative minded members of the post-liberal space, if you will. So you see people who are associated with Compact magazine, for instance. Compact, from my money, and this isn't in any way an insult to them. I think a lot of what they do is terrific, but that would seem to me to be the house organ of American post-liberalism. So what the Edmund Burke Foundation and the NatCon movement, what they've been able to do rather brilliantly, to give the devils their due, is to sort of bring these different strands of the American right together under one banner. Unfortunately, because their foreign policy is so dangerous, and indeed, given what Israel's been up to over the past 9 months, so repugnant, that I think it would be wise to take a very close look at them.
Do you want to talk a little bit about this figure of Robert O'Brien, who I've seen him pop up in the Twitter feed occasionally, and regrettably, I don't really need his commentary, but he's a former Trump national security advisor, and I guess he wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that you talk about in this article that you co-wrote with McGregor, and he's really, really hawkish on China.
Yeah, he is. So McGregor, for your listeners, is Trump's former national security advisor. He's rumored to be in the mix for a very big job should Trump win the election in November. And O'Brien, the point that Doug and I make in the piece is that O'Brien's foreign policy matches almost perfectly. If you did a sort of Venn diagram, it would overlap neatly with the foreign policy of the NatCons. So he is very much a hawk on Iran. I would even say that, he sounds exactly like your garden variety neocon.
I mean, I
And
think in
then
the article you even say that, someone like him may even rival the neocons when it comes to his animus towards Iran.
that's what it certainly seemed like. And anyone who is interested can look up his recent foreign affairs article and see for themselves. The other thing, the other kind of alarming aspect of the O'Brien-Nathan foreign policy is its focus on China. And it's almost, they're almost wishing a second Cold War into existence. And O'Brien isn't alone in this. Another high-profile person in the movement, former Trump administration Pentagon official named Elbridge Colby, has made a career lately out of sounding the alarm with regard to China. And Colby is also rumored to be in the mix for a high-profile job under Trump. Both of these men are very experienced. They're both very bright. I don't necessarily see it in the interest of the United States to be fighting a two-front Cold War between Russia and China. And I think it's a very short-sighted and dangerous thing to tie the existence of Taiwan to American national security aims. So what worries me is that when you survey the electoral landscape at the moment, there really is precious little difference between the two parties. Now, that's not new, but at the very least, one would hope, given Trump's claims to being an America First candidate, that we would expect an American First foreign policy. But that's not what we're getting. We're getting warmed over neoconservatism. So that's a problem. And I don't like this, as you were saying before, this laundering of these reckless neoconservative ideas and passing them off as something that they're not.
With regards to China, what do you think the best conservative case is for not full-heartedly trying to create a conflict with China is? Because I even see a little bit of, I don't know if I would call John Mearsheimer super hawkish on China, but I even think he has some, I mean, he seems to think a conflict is inevitable. Um, and I do think there's a conservative case to be made for restraint when it comes to China. Could you speak to that?
Well, I think your characterization of Mearsheimer's position is correct. That's my reading of it as well. The last
I was
chapter,
trying to be very careful, but or charitable.
the last chapter of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics lays that out. I think that my reading of it anyway, and I won't dare speak for Professor Mearsheimer, who's terrific, is that it's inevitable, is that, as you say, it's inevitable, and that the way that the international system is set up, it's a near impossibility for China's rise to be peaceful. I don't, the other people that we're talking about, I don't know how much they attribute that to the system. In other words, Mearsheimer and Mearsheimer's theory depends a lot on the fact that the international system is one of anarchy, right? There's no global policeman. It seems to me, from the things that I read, that O'Brien and Colby and the NatCons almost think they almost see it as big business. It's good business for the United States to confront China. I'm not so sure about that. And I don't, certainly we should compete with them economically. And certainly we should be, wary of, their kind of blatant disregard for intellectual property and the rest of it. But, it's a country with, I believe, one overseas base in Africa. We have something like 780 overseas military bases. So, I don't get it. And certainly the lessons of the past half century it's no longer seem to be resonating with people like O'Brien and Colby, and that it's madness to want to fight a ground war in Asia. And we should have learned that lesson between the years 1962 and 1975. So again, I think that they're very hawkish posture towards China is reckless, and it's not warranted.
So you mentioned Hazoni. Isn't he also like an admirer of the? I mean, I don't know what else to call him other than a supremacist, a Jewish supremacist, Marakahani.
That's my understanding as well. The historian Suzanne Schneider has written a number of pieces on Hazoni's background that can be found in Dissent magazine, and apparently, yes, Hazoni was a youthful admirer of Kahani. I also think that the decision to move to, marry and then I guess he has a big family, he has a bunch of children, which is terrific. But, the decision to move into the settlements, to become part of that, to live in the occupied territories, speaks to a sort of political commitment that I think should not be welcome among American conservatives. I simply do not. That is lawless. If conservatives are the party of law and order, and if we mean what we say, then I'm not sure that I find that so admirable to do something like that.
Yeah, I mentioned it because you brought up the distinction that historian John Lukács makes between nationalism and patriotism. Why did you pinpoint that and say that NatCons might avail themselves of that distinction?
Well, I think it's first of all, it's the first and maybe only thing I read that made sense to me, that sort of distinguished usefully the difference between what patriotism is and what nationalism is. And in Lukash's telling, it's a question of admiring, on the one hand, the traditions of your land, right? So, and then on the other, which is nationalism, is to be exclusive. So you admire the in an exclusive way your bloodline, your people. And the way Lukács describes it, as nationalism is about being for your people but being against all the others. Patriotism is merely being proud of your land and your country and your traditions, but it doesn't scorn the traditions of others. And I think that's right. And I think that is in keeping with the way post-liberals also see the world. And that if we agree that pluralism is a good domestically, we should probably also agree that pluralism is a good thing internationally as well. And so I think that's kind of the essence of Lukács's making a kind of he was differentiating between patriotism.
Do you think there's a case to be made for differentiating? I mean, differentiating not only patriotism from nationalism, but also patriotism from specifically ethno-nationalism.
Oh yeah. Well, ethno-nationalism is the blood and soil sort of thing. So if you don't have a pure bloodline, if your family hasn't been somewhere for X amount of generations, then some people do it that way. The Germans did in mid-century. We saw how that ended up. Yeah, I don't. It's not an exclusive like the nationalism of a Kahani, of a Hazoni, of the Natcons, of the Israelis, and of the mid-century German fascists is an impossibility in the United States, and we should recognize that. Leave aside whether or not it's good or bad or just or unjust. But think of it simply from a pragmatic point of view. The United States is a continental empire of 330 million people with countless languages spoken and countless religions and ethnicities. So it's like pointless, it's divisive, and I think that's probably part of the reason you see among this crowd this sort of real kind of worshipful interest in Hungary. And so you see a lot. So I think they've even held.
They're very big on Orban. Yeah,
they're big on Orban. They're big on Hungary. I think they've held a NatCon conference over there. I was just over in Hungary. I think it's a lovely place. I think that it's up to the Hungarians what kind of government they want. They want Orban in to the end of time. I don't care. It's a nation of 9.8 million people in the middle of Europe. Yet the NatCons seem to hold this up as some sort of model for the United States to follow. It truly doesn't make any sense at all, except if you look at it from a blood and soil ethno-nationalist perspective. That's a problem. That isn't what this is about. And it's really a dead end. So leaving aside their foreign policy fixations. This stuff isn't it. And then it's not it for another reason too, because what they seem to also seek to be doing is to want to reshape the United States into an Israel, into a Hungary. I shouldn't even compare. I take that back. That's slander against Hungary. But, so at the NatCon, the most recent NatCon conference, they had a panel dedicated to tearing down the division of church and state.
I wanted to ask you about that
Okay.
because I guess it was I forget who it was there. It was one of the people at First Things. I think it was R.R. Reno was
That's right.
talking about the Roberts court needs to tear down the wall between church and state at the recent NatCon conference.
Yes. He said, tear down this wall, clearly invoking Reagan with regard to the Berlin Wall, but he was urging the Roberts Court to tear down the wall between church and state. We have an establishment clause in the First Amendment. I'm an old-fashioned American. I've been here, my family's been here for quite a while, quite a lot longer than, people like Hazoni. And, I find it wildly offensive that these people they're calling themselves conservative, but at the same time, they're seeking to undermine the American Bill of Rights. There's nothing really conservative about that. Wanting to establish, as one of the other panelists said, a kind of Judeo-Christian, theocracy is also wildly offensive. Now, I'm not, and by the way, these new critics of the NatCon movement who've come out over the past month, like Kelly, like Doug, like myself, not woke people, but let me put it to you this way, just from a personal perspective, right? So the tearing down of church and state, the building up of, the Judeo-Christian paradise that these NatCon people and people at First Things want to do. I was raised as a Catholic. I'm not a Catholic anymore. I don't adhere to any of that stuff. I don't want to live under a Judeo-Christian superstate at all. I think that, as an old-fashioned American, I think freedom of religion and the non-establishment of state religion is actually a very, very good thing. I have no desire to live under an America ruled by the likes of John Hagee or Jerry Falwell or whoever, or Meyer Kahane. So, that's another sort of thing that kind of is flying under the radar with these people.
I wanted to add to that because, I think we come from different ends of the political spectrum in a lot of ways, but I remember that Rod Dreher, who I'm not the biggest fan of, especially these days, but that's beside the point. He wrote a piece for the American Conservative back then. I know he's not with American Conservative anymore, but he wrote a piece in 2021, Caesarism from the Post-Liberal Right, where he voiced concerns about this idea of, coercing people into Catholicism or Catholic values. And he basically argued that we're seeing a lot of sort of Caesarist mentality from the national conservatives and adjacent groups. Do you think he was correct to say that in 2021? And do you think it's more true even now, maybe?
Well, I'm surprised to hear that he did write that. I'm happy that he did. I am not remotely a fan of his work. I don't know him. He's supposed to be a very nice guy, but it's not for me. I think, the other thing that people should keep their eye on is this thing called, this movement called integralism. Integralism, if I understand it correctly, and it's entirely possible that I don't, it has to do with this tearing down of the traditional American wall between church and state, and kind of, what would you say, combining aspects of Catholic thought into law. There's a law
This
professor.
is what the Dreher article is actually referencing, the
Yeah.
integralists. Yeah.
So it's like this Harvard law professor named Adrian Vermeule. He also
Yeah.
writes First Things. I would say First Things probably is in support of this stuff. Again, if my whole family's Catholic. If you want to be, if you want to be Catholic, go to church and all that stuff. God bless. Good luck. You shouldn't be forcing it on people who don't want to be, don't believe it. We have a system of, we have a secular system. We have a multi-confessional, secular country. I don't want to live in a theocracy. And I'm
I
happy
mean,
to
in
hear.
a weird way, none of this sounds very conservative. Not what you're saying. I meant, I
Yeah.
mean, these people are essentially calling for like a revolution of the way things are. And to me,
Yeah.
that's really radical. And if I were a conservative, I mean, to me, conservatism means like I want stability and, I don't want the social order disrupted too much.
Yes. That's what I thought it was as well. It sounds to me like a theocratic revolution is what is what they want. Well, no thanks. And I think that people should, especially on the right, since these people are purporting not only to be, our allies, they're really purporting to be the entire movement now. I find that to be, basically borderline insane. If you want to live in a theocracy, you can. There's one in the Middle East, which they all seem to be in love with. Go ahead, but that isn't the America that I understand it to be.
Just a few more things if we can go a little bit longer. Do you think there's a mirror image between the NatCons and certain liberals? What I mean by that is you talk about how they want to internationalize the conservative movement. And I think you see that among certain liberals who want to liberalize the world, even if that may not work pragmatically. And I do think there's a mirror image thing going on there. What say you to that?
I think that's right. I think that you saw a lot of that mirror image on the left, at least. You saw a lot of that mirror imaging happen during the COVID/George Floyd period, the summer of 2020. Yeah, I think that the woke movement is internationalized. I think that's true. I think that, again, like the NatCon desire to internationalize the right doesn't make a lot of sense, especially if conservatism means kind of pride of place. Um, and they've held a number of overseas NatCon conferences. I think it'll come to grief. I unless my reading of history is incorrect, I don't believe that the internationalization of the socialist movement in the 20th century came to much good, didn't come to a happy end. So, that's another troubling part of this.
Also, before we close out here, who do you think conservatives should be looking at for foreign policy wisdom, figures of the past? Because you name a few.
Oh yeah, figures of the past. George F. Kennan, Walter Lippmann, Reinhold Niebuhr, um, would be my top three recommendations. There are people who are now sadly forgotten, but whose works you can find. William Pfaff was a very wise columnist at the Herald Tribune for years, an American based out of Paris. We have, and then of course there are our own founders from the very distant past who wrote very wisely on foreign policy. And Doug and I mentioned, obviously, George Washington's farewell address, 1796, John Quincy Adams. And then there are parts of, in the 20th century, you had parts of Franklin Roosevelt's foreign policy, which people should reacquaint themselves with. in particular, I mean the good neighbor policy of Latin America, John Kennedy's policy with regard to the Soviets. I would urge people to find his address to American University of June 1963. And of course, there's the imperishable Eisenhower farewell address. We have a long, robust tradition in this country. We don't need foreign imports. We've had enough of that. And that's it. I would just urge people to, if they're interested, to rediscover there's an American foreign policy tradition that isn't interventionist, that isn't recklessly internationalist or warmongering.
So there's one last thing I wanted to ask you, and this is for because I know I have listeners. I mean, I have listeners that span across the political spectrum, but a lot of my listeners would define themselves as very much to the left or progressive. And I probably would myself, although I have my disagreements with progressive politicos at times. What do you want to say to them? Why should they maybe be concerned about this national conservatism movement? Because I think it's important that we hear from conservative voices who are warning about where the NatCons want to take us. What do you want to say to those listeners? Because I know you mentioned being in the mold of Buchanan, and I think there's some listeners that will close their ears as soon as they hear that. And I think they're being foolhardy doing that, because I do think you offer a really important critique of NatCons, regardless of any disagreements someone may have with other aspects of your political beliefs.
Well, I think that if you're on the progressive left, the NatCons should worry you because of their very pro-Israel stance, and they should deeply concern you with their seeming desire to gut First Amendment protections and create an American theocracy. I would say to progressives another thing, though, since I wrote almost on a weekly basis for The Nation magazine for 7 years on foreign policy issues, that progressives have a lot of work to do in getting their own house in order. And I would urge them to, we were just speaking about there's a rich American foreign policy tradition of anti-intervention. That tradition has been, in my estimation, almost wholly abandoned by progressives today. And with the exception of my friend Katrina vanden Heuvel, there are very, very few leading progressive voices out there cautioning against the American imperium. And they would do very well to rediscover the tradition embodied by the anti-imperialist league at the turn of the 20th century. In my view, in the years since Trump has kind of been on the scene, progressives have really, really lost the thread. They are way too enthusiastic about waging new Cold Wars and using American foreign policy to push whatever their particular values are. And that's a problem. I think that there used to be. Well, let me just, if I have a moment.
The floor is yours.
In the I would say around, so this is pre-Trump. So around 2015, there were discussions between The Nation magazine on the progressive left and the American conservative on the anti-interventionist right. And there were discussions about doing a joint foreign policy issue between the two. There was, for a brief shining moment, a lot of overlap between the two camps. In my view, because of Trump, the progressives became way, way, way too interested in intervening abroad. And so I guess my message would be to progressives who are listening to this to really think about what the differences are, read Robert O'Brien's piece in Foreign Affairs and really think about if you can see any real differences between what O'Brien is saying and what leading progressive politicians and writers are saying. I think that there's not that much difference, except on Israel. So that's it.
And I would just add to that. I mean, I don't think people should give up their political beliefs, but sometimes you have to engage in very limited sort of alliances or coalitions on specific issues. And I don't think people should be afraid of that. I mean, that's what Rand Paul and Bernie Sanders did with the Yemen War Powers Resolution. I think that could be done with a lot of antitrust and anti-monopolist viewpoints, which there are people that have anti-monopolist and antitrust views on the right. There is a tradition of that. And I think on some issues, very specific issues, people can come together. That doesn't mean we have to give up any of our own values or beliefs, but on specific issues, there can be coalitions.
Absolutely. I think that's absolutely right.
Well, I want to thank you again, James Carden, for coming on Parallax Views. How can my listeners keep up with your work?
The American Committee for U.S. Russia Accord, usrussiaaccord.org. I write a weekly column for the American Conservative, and I still occasionally contribute to The Nation. I'll have a piece out on Kamala Harris's foreign policy advisors this week in The Nation.
Well, that does it for this edition of Parallax Views. As always, if you appreciate the work I do here, please consider supporting me at patreon.com/parallaxviews. One more time, that's patreon.com/parallaxviews. And with that being said, until next time, you've been listening to Parallax Views with Parallax Views to Parallax Views with Parallax Views.
The way out is not simply to say, don't do it, just to prohibit. It's nothing else. If we don't do it, others will be doing it like crazy. So, we have to confront the problem. But no, basically, I know of the great anxieties, problems, new forms of control, but it's also new forms of freedom. This is why I always emphasize that internet and all this new digital stuff, it's a very ambiguous phenomenon, but it's the field of struggle. New forms of enslavement, but at the same time, new incredible forms of freedom. We have to accept the fight with no nostalgia for old, allegedly more authentic communities or whatever. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid.